Hey everybody, it's Katie. Welcome back to Nerdic Inspiration. In this video, I'm trying something a little bit new with a chill voiceover. We're just gonna have a conversation and paint this little guy up. Enjoy. To keep the video interesting, I'm gonna highlight some of the painting methods and colors and steps that I'm taking here to give you a little bit of a tutorial, but most of the time I want to talk about the story behind these figures and the world that I'm creating for them, because that's what excites me and that's what interests me, and that's what spawned these into fruition and why I'm even painting them. This is the second brute that I've painted up for my diorama thing that I'm creating. It's a setting in the world that I'm writing and just thinking up. I have a bunch of these creative settings in my head and the characters that inhabit these places, and so this is just me starting one of those many places. This brute is the crouching brute. I have another standing brute that I finished up that you'll see here shortly. I also have a couple other smaller sprouts that are primed but not yet painted. They are patiently awaiting for their turn, and I'm going to be painting those up pretty similar to how these look here. During this video, you're going to see me using these really shoddy brushes, which I'm showing you here. They're not the best. The brushes themselves were pretty okay when I first got them. A decent set of brushes, not super expensive, a good set of like mini painting brushes, but they are a lot softer than what you actually need to do detailed mini painting. They're more of like a really soft wash, if not layer brush. There's only one or two that I really like in that set, but they work really well for like wet work. And the way I'm painting these models is very much like very wet is the only way I can describe it. It's a lot of like wet blending and creating color gradations. So these brushes work pretty well for that. And because I'm using some color shifting in this model, they get that little like metallic flecking in them. So I don't really care about these brushes. So that's why I'm choosing to use those, because I don't care if they get little color flecks everywhere. So this brute is primed with Vallejo black primer and then highlighted with gray and white for a bit of underpainting in the zenithal highlighting effect. I do everything with a brush. I do not have an airbrush, so any effects that you see on the model, any paint job that I do, it will be by hand with a brush. Because of the way that I'm working with really wet, thin layers, the underpainting actually helped quite a bit with becoming a map for where I was going to apply certain things. I thinned the paint down quite a bit for this model because I'm doing a very subtle wet blending the entire time with a few colors to really give a true gradient from foot to head as I work my way up the model. You'll see that I add vibrant color blocks on top of that a lot too, and that just helps to keep like continuously bringing back layers of the brighter hues, because I do want the colors to retain their true vibrancy. The Meritus blue is the light blue color, the really stark blue. It's not really an electric blue, it's more of like a true blue, but it's not a baby blue. It's got a little bit more of that like brightness to it. And then the Bad Bruise is the purple that I'm using from P3 that I absolutely love. It's like a blue purple, more of an indigo purple, and that color is really pretty. These together are like the exact tones that I pictured, and I even mixed them together to get a little bit of a gradient in there. Like naturally I was creating the gradient on my palette that I was also applying down, and they just mix so beautifully together. The goal for this is to really just get the ideas out of my head and start to get some figures that embody this story that I envision, and hopefully just creating the story around these as they start to come to life. Like as I was painting this, I started to envision what this creature might be doing in that place that it inhabits, and the story of how it got to be the way that it is, and maybe what types of secrets and information this creature might have, or, you know, if it becomes a villainous creature, what types of abilities it has, and kind of working through its stat block. Back to the painting. As you can see, I just keep applying the thin layers of the blue. These creatures are just a lot of folds of the Myconid flesh. And so I would go back and put like a little bit more of the darker blue or that bad bruise color into those recesses to make sure that they stayed relatively dark. So here are the two green colors that I'm using from P3. The necrotic green is probably one of my favorite greens. This color was perfect for what I was looking to do with it. Again, really thin, wet layers are what I'm doing with this, and almost glazing it. And I'm mixing it even with the Meredith blue to get some of those midtones and putting those in areas where I don't want it to necessarily be green. I just want to kind of bring it into the blues so that it can fade out, but I still want there to be like a bit of a green highlight. And the color that it makes when you mix with the Meredith blue is a gorgeous color as well. I love the colors on this model. This is one of my favorite color palettes. So I'm just working that green into the blue, blending and blending and blending all these layers, trying to put it mostly on the true blue areas, getting it a little bit down into the chest, covering a lot of the head with it because that's what's going to have most of those green and yellow tones. And I'm getting most of that true lime, just like the pure necrotic color on the top of the head because that's where I'm going to start to transition that stuff. I just had such a good time. I'm watching myself paint this model because I'm doing a voiceover right now, and it's like bringing back the enjoyment that I felt painting this. I remember I was watching the new season of Sabrina. Don't at me, I think that show is fantastic. I really like it. And I had that going in my ear. I don't have a screen to watch while I'm painting in my existing kind of mashup setup that I have going on, but I can hear the show in my ears and I'm painting this, and I'm just like completely lost this entire time. I was just in the zone. I completed this model in a single session, just nonstop, and I really enjoyed painting this guy. A little bit of backstory and like lore for these creatures. There are stat blocks written for creatures like this in D&D. For these, I modified those stat blocks. I think the base stat blocks written for these creatures are pretty good. So I don't have a need to like really change that. The backstory and origin of the creatures that exist in my world for like these specific creatures is different and has a very unique flavor to it. In comparison to the brutes, the XL fungal creatures that I have are definitely like true XL. They're gonna be like triple the size of these, I'm hoping, when I get them. But I do want like most of these mushroom spore creatures to be larger and then the sprouts to be like really small compared to human creatures. I like that idea. So the armor class for these I'm thinking is 12, since they're pretty fleshy. And then I boosted the HP to these to around 30 is what I'm thinking, with a passive perception of 13. And I raised the perception up from what a lot of the stat block recommendations are because of how I have these creatures interact with one another and the settings that they're in. It just makes sense with some of their abilities for their passive perception to be naturally a bit higher. They have an ectoplasm that fills the spore folds on their flesh, and on the tops of their heads is where it's most prevalent. And that's what has that color shifting look to it. It glows in the light and makes them look translucent and a little bit iridescent. So that ectoplasm has some magical effects, which is why I wanted to make sure to kind of build that into their stat block. These creatures do have dark vision since they live in caverns. They do live in caverns in the habitat that I'm giving them as well. And one of their weaknesses is naturally light, so they do have disadvantage in bright environments. I want these creatures to have disadvantage in any sort of light because they live in such a dark area all the time and they don't leave this setting that I'm putting them in. I want light to be like a true disadvantage to these creatures because they just don't see the light of day very often. Naturally, these creatures don't have any weapons on them. They just use basic melee attacks with their arms, causing 2d4 damage is what I'm calling it, and then for every hit that they land, they would deal an additional 1d4 of temporary poison damage on hit. They have 2 unique spore effects as of now, and these are similar to some of the spore effects you would see in a typical stat block for these creatures, but I've modified them. I'm also thinking about putting an additional unique ability in there related to the ectoplasm. These creatures live in caverns that I'm calling the polyporous caverns, and in my world, these caverns are a myth that are yet to be discovered. Some believe that these caverns were formed by frog-like creatures centuries ago that used the caverns for ceremony and worship. Others believe that the caverns are just tales of what's really just caves of forest overgrowth. However, what most people don't know about these caverns is that they do exist and they radiate ectoplasmic energy. And that energy is what anoints these creatures with the fluorescent colors that they have and those shifts in their flesh tones that sparkle in the light. That's kind of what these dudes are all about. I mean, they're really badass. The sprouts are terrifying. If you haven't seen those, check out my Instagram. The primed versions are on there. If this stuff sounds interesting to you and you're enjoying the video so far, hit that subscribe button because there's more of this stuff to come. More of the lore, more of the diorama building, and more painting of these cool Myconid creatures. So yeah, hit subscribe and come join us on this journey. What I'm doing here is I've actually mixed a little bit of yellow with the necrotic green, and I am dry brushing on that color to almost give it that effect of having like spores, like little spore dust attached to all these different folds, and bringing in the green over the areas of the body as well that I don't want to paint green, but I want to bring green accents into. And I think it really achieves that effect. Like if you look at the legs and everything, it looks like there's little spore dust particles almost attached to the legs and stuff, like it's got this dust that's just flown over and kind of settled in different parts of the model. Sulfuric yellow and then the white from the P3 line are the 2 colors that I start to use for a lot of the highlights. I dry brush multiple layers of those, switching between doing a little bit more wet blending and then re-dry brushing on with different mixtures of yellow and white, and then also very sparsely a little bit of true white. So I actually used the Army Painter Blue Tone Wash a little bit over this model to, again, darken down those recesses again. And the blue tone actually helped to pull together some of it when it started to look a little bit too yellow, a little bit too green. I still wanted to bring back that really dark blue purpley effect that it had previously. So I used the blue wash to wash over those and kind of give it that effect, and then also make sure that I was continuing to tone down those areas that were dark. Here I am dry brushing once again after I've done the wash, and I went and put a little bit more of those coal black areas back into place. I'm dry brushing a little bit of the sulfuric yellow with white mixed to create this really light yellow color, and there's really almost nothing on my brush. Like, I'm doing a very, very light dry brush of this, and it looks like I'm covering the whole model, but I am directing it towards the areas that would receive light. I also use the dark wash, a black wash on the recesses again to really, really darken down those areas that I want to be truly dark, because these creatures live in caves, and so I want them to really have that dark, muggy cavern feel to them. And then this is the color shifting paint that I used to achieve some of that fluorescent, sparkly feel to the tops and the accent pieces on these detailed models. All right, mini completed. I am incredibly happy with how these broods came out. My vision is coming to life, and I cannot wait to finish up the sprouts and populate the polyporous caverns. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you've made it this far, let me know in the comments below if you enjoy this style of video. As always, links are in the description to my Discord and Patreon if you're willing and able to support the channel in that way.